All right. Good morning, everyone, or I guess afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our third installment of Decode Debate. The debate today, it's going to be all about immigration, accountability, and advocacy. It's Biden and the border. We have two amazing panelists, Susi Duran from Poder Latinx and Phi Nguyen from Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta. Let's see, Susanna is the Georgia State Director. Poder Latinx's mission is to build a political wave where the Latinx community plays a key role in the transformation of our country, where immigrants, Latinx, and other people of color are decision makers of the political process. She's also done a lot of other great things, like being a member of the board of directors for the North Georgia Low Income Taxpayers Clinic, and a program coordinator for the Atlanta North Georgia Labor Council. And so we're so happy to have her. And Phi Nguyen is the litigation director for Asian Americans Advancing Justice. She focuses on impact litigation in the areas of voting rights and immigrant justice. Since joining Advancing Justice in Atlanta in early 2017, she's helped block a Georgia state law that restricted voters' rights to an interpreter at the polls and represented a class of Vietnamese immigrants suing the federal government over indefinite nature of their detention in ICE prisons. She graduated from Georgia State University Law School in 2009 and practiced as a medical malpractice trial lawyer for 8 years before dedicating herself to community-centered civil rights litigation. So I'm super excited to have them both here with us. And joining us for this very important conversation. So welcome, both of y'all. So I guess we'll just jump into it. And the first question is, how did you get involved, Susi, in this work?
I think at a certain point, it's like, how can you not get involved? Really? I think if we want to go to like OG, the origin story, I was a student at KSU at Kennesaw State, and I was student organizing before I knew that what student organizing was. We were organizing like an openly secular student organization at KSU where there's a whole bunch of weird stuff going on when you're saying you don't believe in God, and they're like marking all your flyers and like kind of seeking you out and trying to cause trouble, which is really weird. But I think after that, kind of getting more involved in like more the immigrant kind of rights intersection, I met with Dr. Emiko Soltis at Freedom University and had like our first action at occupying one of 3 public universities that banned undocumented and DACA students from even applying. And then another university, Georgia Public University ban is that despite meeting in-state tuition eligibility requirements, undocumented and DACA students still have to pay out-of-state tuition or international rates. So that's kind of how I started. And then from there, like once there was this old man announcing he was running for president, you start meeting like all these other activists in Atlanta. And after that, you just get sucked in. It's a rabbit hole. And then you start learning about so many issues that intersect so much, especially in a rich city like Atlanta with a rich history and rich culture and just rich food and everything. But I've been all over the place. Like also, when I transferred to Georgia State, we were the student organizing arm to work around the community benefits agreement for when Georgia State was buying Turner Field. And the student group, we were trying to pressure the university president, Mark Becker, to sign this community benefits agreement for the neighboring communities. Then I ended up in DC organizing restaurant workers, and I came back to save my house from rising property taxes in Atlanta. A whole other issue. But then I moved to the Labor Council, and now at Poder Latinx, making sure that, the Latinx community, we become part of the decision-making process, that we become part of the policy-making process too. Our communities are just not long neglected. It's very transactional, very pandering to us, and we want to make sure that, engagement happens year-long, even after every election.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Phi, I know you're this amazing civil rights lawyer. Sometimes folks get it confused and think you like represent folks in actual like an immigration attorney. So tell us what brought you to this work and why did you leave like Med Mal? I'm sure that was a nice salary. And so like what brought you to this work and to AAJ and where you are now?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Fallon. And for the warm introduction. I think like Susi, I've had a lot of different entry points into the work that I'm doing now. And I also feel like the work is constantly shifting as we kind of realize how intersectional all of the issues are. And I think that you know that well too, Fallon. But I would identify, actually similarly to Susie as well, one entry point that I had into the space of immigrant rights work was while I was a medical malpractice attorney. I served on the board of a nonprofit that my sister started called Athena's Warehouse. We worked with high school girls in underserved public high schools, and one of the main high school that we worked with was Cross Keys in Brookhaven. And it just so happens that there is a significant immigrant population there. So a lot of the young women that we worked with were either themselves immigrants or were second generation. And a number of them, again, were either undocumented or they came from mixed status families. So they had family members who were undocumented. And I think that before working with these young women, I don't think that I knew anybody who was undocumented, or if I did, I wasn't aware of that. And through working with them, and what we did was we had a few different programs, but mostly we did after school programs, including programming that was focused around trying to increase their self-esteem, focus on healthy eating, safe sex, and various issues. And what we realized through that process was that regardless of how much support that we gave them, there were policies in place in the state of Georgia that prevented them and blocked them from being able to go further. So if there was a young woman who wanted to go to college in Georgia after graduating from high school, then our state actually banned undocumented students from the top universities in Georgia. And then where undocumented students are allowed to go, they are charged at they're charged really high tuition. So they have to pay out of the state tuition. And so that was economically infeasible for a lot of the young women that we worked with. And so that was sort of my entryway into realizing that we have these policies in the state of Georgia that really make it hard for undocumented immigrants to thrive. And then my entryway into doing work with Advancing Justice Atlanta specifically came about because I think it was in 2016 I decided that I think I learned somehow, I don't know where, but somebody told me that Asian Americans had the lowest voter turnout out of all races, and I had not encountered that statistic before, and so I was interested in it. It led me to be curious about what factors contribute to political engagement, and then I also decided that I wanted to help increase political engagement among the Asian American community in Georgia. So I organized a voter registration drive that was specifically doing outreach to Vietnamese voters and South Asian voters, and corralled a number of volunteers. And what I realized, first of all, it was very, very humbling work. And the other thing that I realized through that process was how necessary it was for people doing outreach in the Vietnamese community to have Vietnamese language skills in order to be able to actually communicate properly with our communities, which my Vietnamese language skills are not great. So it was a struggle for me. But from there, I just got more engaged and then worked on a number. I actually partnered with Advancing Justice as a volunteer in 2016 and did just a grassroots campaign called Vietnamese Voices, where we helped to register 600 new Vietnamese voters in Georgia. And then it kind of just took off from there, in the same way that Susie said, that once you get your foot in the door a little bit, you start seeing all of these other issues. And after we registered voters, I realized, well, wait, we also need to educate voters. They need to understand, how their vote actually connects to policies, et cetera. And so I eventually left my malpractice job and joined Advancing Justice as the litigation director.
That's amazing. So I guess the next question is sort of like, how did we get here, right? So everyone, I don't want to say everyone, but folks seem to start paying more attention under the previous president, right? To things that were going on. But we know that there's a history of policy and stuff. So like, how did we get here for as like immigration policy? What is the history or background of like where we are now?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a big question, but I wanted to focus specifically on sort of the history of detention and deportation and how we got to present day where we have a pretty massive and sprawling detention and deportation network that preceded the Trump administration. So I think what I want to focus our attention on would probably be the 1990s and what happened there. And I think a lot of people know that the 90s were a time where there were a lot of tough on crime policies, both at the state and federal level. And so, as a part of that, in 1996, there were two particularly relevant and harmful, I would say, bills that were signed by President Clinton that have had, I think, a tremendous impact and continue to have a tremendous impact on our deportation and detention network. And so those bills were the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act and the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, or you'll hear a lot of advocates refer to that latter one as IRA for shorthand because they're so long. But these bills did a number of things, and but they certainly criminalized immigration, I think, more so than it had ever been in the past. So, and really are the starting place where I think immigration and criminal law started to become much more intertwined. So some of the things that it did was it made more people deportable based on criminal convictions. So it vastly increased the criminal convictions that would lead to people becoming deportable if they were not a citizen, and that would include people who were lawful permanent residents, people who had a green card. They could lose their green card because of a wide range of criminal convictions, which could include minor drug offenses. It also really increased the detention network by requiring mandatory detention of immigrants who had criminal convictions and were going through a deportation proceeding because of an underlying criminal conviction. It also made it much harder for people to get legal status. So if you before 1996, if you were going through a deportation or removal proceeding, then you had more defenses, and judges had way more discretion to allow you to stay in the country because of things like the amount of time that you had been in the country, your family ties, and these laws kind of gutted some of those humanitarian forms of relief for people who are at risk of deportation. And it also allowed for fast tracking deportation, especially for people who are new arrivals who are apprehended at the border. And so obviously, if you are going through the deportation process in a fast track manner without access to an attorney, you're not really going to get a fair shake of fighting your case. So that is also something else that happens. And I do and this kind of ties into, I think, something Susie will touch on later, but I do want to give an example of how this kind of plays out and is continuing to play out. But um, Southeast Asian, and I'm Vietnamese, so I have a little bit of a personal connection to this issue too. But Vietnamese and other Southeast Asian people came to America as refugees. A number of them came in the 70s, but people were coming here as refugees through, I think, the early 90s. There were large waves of Southeast Asian refugees during that period of time. And so um, when they were resettled, a lot of them were resettled in resource poor neighborhoods and grew up as, traumatized refugees, sort of in the time of this crackdown on crimes. And so they were in over policed neighborhoods. Um, a lot of them fell into gang activity related to being poor and being traumatized by war and you know making just falling into the sort of wrong activity at the time. Um, and what would happen is people would have, as teenagers, as young people, they would have criminal convictions. They would have green cards. They would get a criminal conviction. They would serve their time in prison, and then they would also have this sort of double jeopardy or double punishment in effect, where then they would also go through removal proceedings and get stripped of their green card. And that is sort of an example, I think, of how the criminal legal system and the deportation system are connected. And there are a lot of Southeast Asian refugees who are in the position now where they are getting deported from these old criminal convictions, and they don't have any immigration relief that they can really seek, because our immigration laws are so punitive for people who have criminal convictions. And so I really think in the 90s, we passed laws that make the immigration system so much more punitive than it ever was before that. Um, and then I think another important moment to identify in the history of immigration law as it pertains to immigration enforcement is after 9/11. Then there was another sort of crackdown, and this move to secure the borders, and another sort of I think turbocharged era of trying to of really criminalizing immigration, right? And so at that time, that's when um, the immigration enforcement was actually moved from the Department of Justice to the Department of Homeland Security. So immigration also became this national security issue. And that's also when ICE was created. So ICE has not been around for that long, but that's when it was created. And around the same time, then I think uh, the federal government pumped a ton of money into immigration enforcement as well. And so those are a few things that really laid the groundwork for the massive deportation and detention system that exists today. And we saw all of that get turbocharged under the Trump administration, but certainly all of this existed prior to Trump. And in fact, Obama is commonly referred to as the deporter in chief, because so many people were deported under Obama. And he also had his priorities for enforcement were people who had felony convictions. And so, you know, his sort of motto was felons, not families, in terms of who was who was a priority for deportation. And what you saw under the Trump administration is everybody became a priority, regardless of whether they had a criminal conviction or not. But when we talk about what we want to see today and where there are areas for advocacy and improvement, um, I think we really need to examine the way that the current administration is still sort of targeting people who have these prior criminal convictions. I'll stop there.
No, that was like a lot of great information, because when we tend to think about the crime bill in the 90s and this tough on crime, I mean, more lately when we're thinking about mass incarceration, we think about the impact it's had on, and Black folks specifically and their overrepresentation in incarceration. But we don't think about the consequences that it also had, for immigration. And a lot of times also, like when it comes to 9/11, when it's cloaked in this idea of national security, we're like, well, we tend to give up our rights when we think it's going to make us safer. Like we give them up willingly, right? We're like, well, if that means that, so, and like in times of quote unquote turmoil, right? Like we tend to be more susceptible to like these sweeping, broad policy changes that ultimately continue to exacerbate these systems. And it's very interesting because a lot of times we forget that ICE in the grand scheme of government is relatively new, right? Like we're just like, ICE has always been around and whatever, it is what it is. And I think it's also has some parallels to like the sort of like, well, we can just reform the system versus like abolishing it, right? And because it kind of, in my personal opinion, came out of like this fear mongering, how do you like fix a system that is doing what it was designed to do, right? And so I guess with that, like being said, like the next sort of thing we wanted to think about or ask about is sort of like, what's the difference, or what's, we've been hearing about like there's refugee caps, and what's the difference between like refugees and asylum seekers, and what about someone that's just coming for a better life? I guess, Susie, like, can you touch on what all these differences and nuances are?
Yeah, of course. So maybe like Phi, I also had a brief time in private, except I did workers' compensation and very brief stint in immigration, and it was only for a little short amount of time, but it's heartbreaking and devastating work. So for example, asylum and refugee. So the distinction is that if you're still in your home country and you have reasonable, you're trying to flee something, violence. If you're still in your home country, then you are trying to petition to enter the U.S. as a refugee. If you make it to the U.S. because you're fleeing violence or whatever fear or anything like that, then you would be seeking asylum. So the distinction really is where are you physically? And under the Trump administration, there's first of all, there's an admissions cap on refugees, which why are we putting a number on how many people can come to this country to escape whatever they're trying to escape, right? So under Trump, there was a refugee cap of admissions of 15,000. And Biden had made the promise that he would raise that cap. So that promise was made. However, he walked that back. He decided to keep it at 15,000, the same level under the Trump administration. However, thanks to a lot of outcry by progressive organizations and immigrant activists, he lifted that to 62,500, with the goal of trying to reach 125,000 by the end of the fiscal year, which I believe is in September. However, he doesn't think this number is realistic. He is blaming the Trump administration for decimating this refugee process. The paperwork and the administrative side that isn't something that's really reasonable and easy to scale up. Under President Obama, he had the cap at 110,000 refugees per year. So it's not something that's so hard to go back or to revert to. Even then, these numbers are lower than what President Obama had in his first year. But so President Biden has gone back and forth with this admissions cap, right? And there's kind of like two. There's one reason was like the appearance, right? It was the optics, with the border crisis in the southern border. He don't want to make it seem like we're increasing migration or that we're exacerbating whatever that issue is in the border, right? But these caps on refugees isn't just a general cap, refugees from anywhere. It's from different parts of the world. So an X amount of refugees can come from Africa, an X amount can come from Latin America, and an X amount from Asia, and a general amount unallocated. So these, not only is there a cap, but it's a quota. It's allocated based on what country you're coming from, and we cannot we cannot discuss first of all, the immorality of putting quotas and numbers and caps on people seeking safety and stability. We can't talk about that without talking about our increased militarization and also the policing. I think Pete made a really good point about, domestically, we're criminalizing so many things that ultimately end up affecting immigration process. A lot of folks who maybe they had 2 or 3 DUIs, which eventually becomes a felony, then that blocks someone from even seeking any kind of status or paperwork to improve the immigration status. But when we're, with increased U.S. militarization abroad, we're funding governments that are sanctioning and ordering violence against people. When we're placing economic sanctions on other countries too, those folks have to leave and go somewhere safe and stable. And oftentimes that means coming to the US. And then not only are we terrorizing their homes, we can't even let them come here. But the quotas and all this, it has a long, long racist history in the US immigration context. So when you think about it from 1790 to 1952, so legislators just restricted naturalization, the process in which immigrants become citizens, to specific racial and ethnic groups, obviously with the preference from white from Northwestern Europe. And, we, as we touched upon, that there's been quotas on people, like the Chinese Exclusion Acts or Border Patrol, when they were trying to restrict kind of the Braceros program when the US needed labor. And so there was an exchange program with Mexico, of which my grandfather was actually a Bracero too. And he went back and forth to US and Mexico to work on farmland. But it's one of those things where it's a matter of humanity, it's a matter of morality, not so much of whether it's economically feasible, which any economic argument just doesn't make any sense, because it is an economic argument because we are destroying people's homelands, we're destroying their financial and emotional and physical well-being, and we can't even let them escape that. We're terrorizing their homes and blocking them from going anywhere else. So that's kind of where we are with the refugee admission cap under President Biden. Only because there was that outcry from folks holding him accountable to what he promised on the campaign trail did he go back and lift that admission cap. He doesn't think it'll be realistic, but we can keep on pushing because we need to increase that number and we need to end the allocations per country, at least not while we're terrorizing other countries. It's inhumane, it's unreasonable, and it's just xenophobic and racist because, we keep terrorizing folks' country, we block them, and then if they make it here, we deport them back to their dangerous countries where they are, they're fearing their livelihoods. But yeah, it's a very hard topic to talk about. One thing is, the Biden, and this isn't just one thing that the Biden administration has fallen short on welcoming immigrants and ending deportations, the continuous deportations of Haitians and other Black immigrants to dangerous countries. There's been no extension of temporary protection status for Haiti and other countries. We're still waiting on on May 15th for him to finalize that admission cap for refugees. There's been no permanent cuts to detention, and there's been no public movement on the federal level to end the 287G program, which is where local sheriffs and police departments get to collaborate with ICE to detain immigrants based on nothing else but racial profiling, because there's no way to look at somebody and say, look, they weren't born here and they don't have documents. Nothing but racial profiling. And then just despite his 100-day moratorium, over 100,000 people have still been deported and people are still being detained. And that's still family separation. When you're, Stewart County, Irwin County detention centers in Georgia, that's South Georgia, that's rural Georgia, that's miles and hours away. Simply by being detained and being transferred there, you're already being separated from your family, especially during this pandemic where they can't even come visit you.
Thank you, Susie. That's very important. And I think, the TPS status or the temporary protective status that hasn't been renewed for several countries is just very important. And I just appreciate you talking about this, and especially, how you mentioned your grandfather has been part of these programs in the past, and how this is like, it touches so many of us, right? Like it's one of those things that sometimes we don't think about, or it's in the background. And then as you were talking about at the end about the 287G program, and I think, you know, a lot of the groups on the ground here have been great about, especially in sheriff's races. I know AAJ along with Potter Latinx has been about making sure that, you know, we make that part of the campaign, right? Like make it very clear that folks are willing to end 287G. And with the election of new sheriffs in Cobb and Gwinnett, and I believe Augusta as well, right? All three of them have ended 287G programs, which is, you know, it's a step in the right direction, but of course it could be ended on the federal level and then just end everywhere, right? And instead of like this sort of piecemeal system. And so as we're thinking about, like you mentioned, you know, Stewart and Irwin and immigration detention, B, can you just talk about like, so sort of like that process and like what happens? I know we have several of them in Atlanta, and then I know not Atlanta, in Georgia. And then at one point, Atlanta did back out of actually housing detainees at the Atlanta City Detention Center. And, you know, that sounds good, right? But it seems like we should be going a lot further.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Fallon, for that question. You know, I was referring earlier to this vast and sprawling deportation and detention network that we have, and just to give some specific numbers, in the fiscal year of 2019, our federal government was detaining over 500,000 immigrants in a system that included over 200 jails across the country, and about 80% of the facilities where immigrant detainees were housed were run by private for-profit companies. Another sort of metric there is the average daily population of immigrants who were in detention in 2019 was 50,000. I do want to say, I mean, I know we have been talking about areas where the Biden administration can improve and should improve, and we should continue to push them to improve. But I do want to say that things have improved in some ways for sure. And one area in which the administration, I think, has improved is ICE detention. The number of immigrants in ICE detention right now has dropped, and I don't have the number as of today, but it had dropped to a record low of 13,529 by the end of February. And I think some of this is due to folks getting released because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and a lot of lawsuits that popped up because of immigrants still being detained through the pandemic. And then the other factor at play, I think, is that once Biden came to power, then he did issue new priorities for who's a priority for enforcement, and basically has directed his administration to release people who from detention if they're not a priority. And so right now, what ICE is supposed to be doing is reviewing people who are in custody and determining whether they are an enforcement for priority, and if they're not, then they're supposed to be released. And then in Georgia, we have also seen the number of people in our detention centers drop as well. And as Fallon mentioned, there are 3 major private for-profit immigration detention centers in Georgia. There's the Irwin County Detention Center, or ICDC. There's Stewart, and there's Folkston, and those are all in rural areas, very far away from major metro areas, which really isolates the people who are detained there, and makes it really difficult for them to have access to legal counsel. They're also notorious, and have been notorious for years, for horrible conditions inside the detention facilities and rampant abuse. There are several reports about all of the various abuses and terrible conditions within those facilities. And certainly, just anecdotally, the clients that we've represented at Advancing Justice Atlanta have also told us about some of the terrible conditions that they have faced. And one area, or one sort of horror story that came to national attention, was around ICDC, and I think that that came to light in 2020, was that there were dozens of immigrant women, at least I think around 60 of them, who reported that they were they were forced to undergo gynecological procedures without informed consent. And thanks to a lot of organizing efforts and lawsuits that were filed, then I think there are no longer any women who are currently detained at the Irwin County Detention Center, which is incredible, but wouldn't have happened without there really being a light shown on the abuse there, and people continuing to shine that light on that situation. But you know, immigration detention is still an issue. And in 2020, 21 people died in ICE detention, including 8 from COVID-19. And in fact, our Advancing Justice Atlanta, along with the Southern Poverty Law Center, at the beginning of the pandemic, filed litigation to try to get medically vulnerable people out of detention because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we lost. We weren't able to get clients out of there. And so, you know, even as we were able to work from home, our clients were, and then the court systems were able to work remotely. Our clients were languishing in these detention centers, and some of them got COVID. And unfortunately, a lot of people died from COVID in immigration detention centers and in jails. And then, I think, sorry, I'm like trying to keep track of some of the questions that you asked, Fallon. I think you asked about the Atlanta jail, which did have a contract with ICE, which ended also through organizing work. But you know, there are all of these local wins that can be had, and we should and can continue to disentangle local law enforcement from ICE. But there's more work to be done there. And then I think, you know, Fallon, I kind of, the name of this show is, you know, is about the border, and I kind of focused a lot of our attention on what's happening on the interior versus what's happening at the border. But I did just want to briefly mention that even though ICE detention is down, then detention of migrant children at the border is up. The number of migrant children in federal custody more than doubled in the past 2 months. And I think the numbers that I saw from this week is that there's around 21,000 kids who are being housed by the federal government right now. And I think the reasons for this increase, I think, are complicated. But one of the reasons is that under the Trump administration, then there was a zero tolerance policy, and where families were getting separated at the border. And there was also a remain in Mexico policy where people who came to seek asylum were basically turned away and had to stay in Mexico while they were seeking asylum in the U.S. The Biden administration has reversed that in part. So now they're allowing they're allowing children in if they're seeking asylum, but not adults. So what's been happening is that instead of our federal government forcibly separating families at the borders, families are voluntarily separating themselves from their children because the adults know that they're not going to be able to get into the US, that they'll still have to remain in Mexico. And so they're sending their children unaccompanied into the US. And while I think there's concern that some of the housing is that there's not enough oversight at some of the sort of emergency housing that has popped up to house the migrant children before they're able to be connected to a sponsor. Some of the facilities I think are okay, but obviously it's an area of concern because we know from past experience and current experience that these facilities are always rife with abuse and lack of access to sometimes just basic human needs.
Well, that's very interesting and unfortunate because it's like we're like, okay, that policy has ended of separating, but now it's essentially, it's still like de facto. So essentially the separation is still happening because, you know, folks are forced to make these, like, I don't know, unbearable choices, right? I don't know what I would do as a parent, you know, in trying to make that choice, right? And you want to provide your children with a better life, but does that mean that you send them on by themselves, or do you, you know, try to wait it out? So I can imagine having to make some of those decisions. And then moving along a little bit and just thinking about, you know, this sort of advocacy, accountability piece, and like what we can do and how we can support. I want to just, if we can, Susie, touch on the Biden rally that happened 2 weeks ago, a couple weeks ago, I believe, and you know there was a protest there, and you know there were some folks saying that, you know, it was bad because it was disruptive, but you know all protests have, most of the time they have a message and they have a point, right? And they're bringing awareness to some issues, and I think it's important that no matter who we have in office, that we hold them accountable. To not just their campaign promises, but to serve all people, right? And so can you tell us more about like what happened at the rally, and then what the continuations from that are, and how we can continue to help advocate and push forward those policies and objectives?
Yeah, of course. So earlier this month, I think it was, I think about 2-3 weeks ago, time is a blur to me. But you know, President Biden had a rally in Gwinnett County, and a group of local Georgia immigrant organizers, they disrupted that rally, asking for an end to detention and deportations. So there was a lot, you know, some folks tossed trash at them. Some folks did not like that they were disrupting President Biden. Later, some folks have commented publicly that, you know, they would have wanted to strangle them because of this interruption. And first of all, why are we holding these kind of feelings and doing these things? First of all, these are directly impacted immigrants or adjacent. These are activists, these are organizers, these are people who came out to organize. They also came out to vote for President Biden. Senators weren't knocking us off. So they contributed to those seats, first of all. So it's very despicable and deplorable that people would be ashamed, embarrassed, upset, or almost bordering on threatening assault to these activists who are caring about an issue that's important and very dear to their hearts, and not just to theirs, but the rest of ours. So during the rally, you know, they disrupted President Biden, asking for an end to detentions and deportations and the private run detention centers in Georgia too. And he replied, you know, it was a little bit hard to understand, but there was some clear footage later saying, you know, give me 5 days. Give me 5 days, replied President Biden. And so later, when the press asked Biden for a response or a statement based on that, President Biden said he was teasing. I'm not sure about you, but teasing about family separation, teasing about the inhumane human rights violations in detention centers, teasing about refugee and asylum, that is not something to tease about. It simply is not. That is disrespect, and that is indignity. You know, families right now are being separated by being detained hundreds of miles away from home, by being deported, and Biden thought they did not deserve a response worthy of respect, dignity, or even a serious one. And today, the group of disruptors and other allies, accomplices, and comrades and organizers sent President Biden, DHS, Mayorkas, Senators Warnock and Ossoff a letter in response. And from this letter, for example, one of the disruptors, Lian Estrella Sanchez, she's a director and founder of Community Estrella. This is her testimony. She said, and I quote, "Being in solitary confinement under ICE custody was terrible and humiliating. I spent 13 months in an inhumane, unhealthy place where our rights were violated and we were forced to do labor just for seeking refuge. Our only crime was seeking security and protection in this country. It was time for the people, the directly and indirectly impacted communities, to take command of these movements. I believed in your promises during the election, and this is why I risked it all to knock on doors and campaign to turn Georgia blue. When you said you were teasing us, were you joking with democracy, the suffering of individuals, and the people who helped elect you? This was not the first time we have sent messages similar to the one we share today. We want those places to be closed. Not only that, we want all immigrants to be freed from ICE custody." She was there to disrupt the rally where President Biden was in. And many of these Georgia organizers knocked on doors and encouraged the vote for the historic win in this peach state. Many individuals supported the words that day. They also fought hard for the elections of these senators, giving the party the control of Congress. And now that there marks 100 days in office, that there was a reason for this interruption. And I mentioned it before, when President Biden walked back on the promise to raise the refugee admission cap, it was because of outcry, that work of accountability to push him to keep his promise. This is simply another iteration, another version. Direct action gets the goods. If conversations aren't helping, if doing it the nice way isn't helping, then sometimes you have to go in person and demand these things, because something that's being demanded is not unreasonable. It is inhumane to ignore these kinds of demands. There are just too many historical wrongs to undo, including the immigrant detention regime. So one of the demands, from not just these activists and organizers that disrupted President Biden, but also so many of us that have worked in immigration, was to immediately close all ICE detention centers and private prisons. This is including Irwin County Detention Center and Stewart County Detention Center and the Folkestone ICE Processing Center in Georgia. And this is from the letter they sent to Biden. These are the demands. Also, to end all contracts with for-profit detention companies, including LaSalle, GEO Group, and Core Civic, and to halt programs of ICE collaboration with local law enforcement and corrections departments. This is the 287G program. And also to pay detained immigrants all back wages owed to them for work they performed while detained at these facilities. I'm not sure about you, but labor done by detained folks is slave labor, especially because they are not paid. And also, we cannot ignore the fact that we must stop funding the militarization of borders and the expansion of policing and prisons for U.S., Mexican, Central American governments to deter immigration. And this letter was sent out today. I believe someone has shared the letter in the comments of the Facebook Live. But this is something important, and I'm going to repeat, it is despicable and deplorable for anyone who have thrown trash to these disruptors. That one person that publicly commented saying they would have wanted to strangle these. This is not correct. This is disrespectful, and this is a threat. You're threatening folks who just want better lives for themselves.
Thank you, Susie, and we so appreciate you making sure to uplift the organizers. It's important that we put names and we tell their stories, because it's one thing for us that maybe weren't there to talk about it or to share it, but it's another, to actually put names and faces to the folks that are leading this. And so I appreciate that. And I know you have to run to another thing, Susie, so thank you for joining us. For the rest of y'all here with us, we have a few moments for question and answer. And so if you have any questions for us or anything you would like to share, please drop it in the chat, and Phi and I will do our best to answer your questions. And just, thank you for joining us, of course, again, for our Decode the Debate series. So as we're waiting to see if there's any questions, Phi, is there anything that you would like to tell us about how folks can follow the work of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, how they can get involved, how they can follow you, all those type of things?
Yeah, you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. Now I had to look up our handles. Our Instagram is, let's see.
And then
well,
while you're looking at it up, can you tell us maybe a little bit about because, we also know a lot of this stuff is all connected to voting and putting the right folks in the right places. And I know Asian American Advances Justice has, filed or participating in some of the lawsuits that are fighting back against the horrendous, voter dissuasion of laws that have been recently signed in. So if you could tell us a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, sure. So we are one of the many groups who is fighting back against Senate Bill 202, which just passed out of the Georgia General Assembly in, was it March or April? Now I'm this first half of the year has been a blur, but it really makes some sweeping changes to our elections laws, and a lot of groups are fighting back. Our lawsuit, which is on behalf of Advancing Justice Atlanta and on several Asian American voters, focuses specifically on the provisions that make absentee by mail voting harder. And there are several restrictions that make it harder, including making really limiting use of drop boxes, which I know a lot of people relied on. Adding a photo ID requirement to requesting an absentee ballot, shortening the timeline to request and receive an absentee ballot. Those are some of the ones that jump to mind right now. But we are challenging those provisions, and the reason why we're focusing on those provisions that attack absentee by mail voting is because Asian Americans voted by mail at the highest rates, both in the general election and in the Senate runoffs. So that's why we're focusing on that, because it was clearly a preferred way of voting by our communities. But yeah, that's early in the litigation stage, but we are committed to the fight, and a lot of other folks are as well. Our handle on Instagram is advancing_justice_ATL. And then on Facebook, I think you could just look up Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta, and that will pull up. Oh, Fallon, if you're talking, you are muted.
You'd think we would get this together after how long have we been on video things? But thank you. I was gonna say, I know that Asian American Advancing Justice has signed on to the letter that Susi has referenced, and I know Georgia Alliance has as well. And so it's been great to see the support as in the coming together of all the Georgia groups in support of directly impacted folks and taking a stand against immigration detention and holding folks accountable. And so and I see that there's been some other call to actions in the chat, but I guess as we kind of close out, are there any other call to actions? What can we do? Oh wait, here's a question. Should advocates and activists approach state lawmakers the same way we approached Biden on this issue?
Yeah, I think that there are ways. I think that there are things that can be done on every level, that there can be victories had at the local, state, and federal level. So I do think that advocates and activists should approach state lawmakers the same way that Biden was approached. But I think obviously the federal government and what Biden's able to do is different from what a state lawmaker is able to do, or a local election or a local official is able to do. And so I think it's about raising those issues to elected leaders and seeing what they're able to do that's within their jurisdiction and within their scope of power. And I think, I guess I would say two things. One thing, as a litigator, we were very accustomed on the immigration front to just duking things out in court with the last administration. And I think what's different with the change in administration is, I will say, I do, obviously it's not been perfect, but I will say that the Biden administration has been, I think, more willing to come to the table with advocates. So there's more of a willingness to listen if people are out there and making sure that, making them listen, right? So the opportunity is there, and it's less likely to fall, I think, on ears that won't listen. And then the other piece that I want to uplift is, while we are seeing improvements in a number of ways on the immigration front, some of the I guess some of the progress that we've seen is rolling back Trump era immigration policies. But I think we need to demand more, because we need to remember that things were already in a bad position before the Trump administration came to power. And I would really ask people to really think about the ways that we're continuing to sort of perpetuate this good immigrant, bad immigrant narrative, and to focus on that issue, because the people who are going to be left behind, even as we may see changes in immigration policy that's more welcoming to people, the people who are always going to be left behind are the people who have criminal convictions, the people that we're able to really say are the bad immigrants. And so that is an area that I think that this administration needs to continue to be pushed on.
Gotcha. Okay, well, thanks so much. I appreciate your time here and today. And is there any final call to action of how we can hold folks accountable? Or I know you kind of touched on it in the answer to the question about the different levels, but is there anything that we could do today to further uplift these issues and to kind of keep them in the forefront and continue to push for change?
Fallon, I feel like I should have been prepared for that question.
I'm sorry for putting you on the spot.
without a great answer. I don't know. I mean, I know maybe people can amplify the letter that Susi had shared with people. I think that's a good call to action for today.
Definitely. Awesome. Well, thank you for your time, V. You're always so gracious when I reach out to you and ask you to do things. And I just so appreciate you joining us. So this, of course, was the third installment. We are every other Thursday at 12 noon, lunchtime. Next time will be all about the June 15th.
You went on mute again, Fallon.
Sorry, my dog was barking, so I was like, oh, try to get that out the background. But anyway, so again, this was the third installment, and we're so happy to have everyone join us. Next time on May 27th at 12 noon will be all about the June 15th special elections. I know we're kind of electioned and voting out in Georgia, but there are no off years. And so even though we have the special elections in June, there's some school board races. There's also House District 34 in Cobb, House District 156 down there in Vidalia. So we'll take a deep dive into everything that's going to be on the ballot on June 15th. And then, of course, in lots of places, including City of Atlanta, we do have municipal elections coming up in November. So just stay tuned. Like I said, every other Thursday at noon, we'll have some great series. And I know like I said, on May 27th, it will be Paul Glaze and Kimberlyn Carter talking all about special elections. Then in June, we have Georgia Justice Project and Reform Georgia talking about the new probation laws and how you can potentially end your probation earlier. Then we have Georgia Conservation Voters and Sierra Club talking all about how we save the planet. So please continue to join us for these series, and thank y'all. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Fallon.